This is the Navigating an Ancient Faith podcast. My name is David Gortney, and with me is my brother Jared Gortney.
Hey man, what's going on?
Yeah. Good morning. We had
It's been a good weekend.
Good breakfast, and we are actually in the same room again today. Hopefully we can knock this whole series out while we're just sitting here
that'd be nice.
together and still doing the remote thing.
Yeah, it's a lot easier when you kind of keep the flow of thoughts going from one episode to the next without waiting a week or two in between. Even though that's the way it's going to be dropped, but that kind of keeps our minds straight.
And then I also find that in between the podcasts, like we go grab something to eat or coffee, and we just continue to talk about it. So we're ready to jump into the next
that's
one.
right.
So
that's
been helpful as well. So this has been fun. Maybe we'll have to do this like go to a cabin in the fall and knock out another series. Or something
we've been
like
saying
that.
this is the way to do this. This is the only way to kind of keep us on track.
This changes everything. Doesn't it? Yeah,
that's right.
Well, so you are listening to the Navigating an Ancient Faith podcast, and we're in the middle of a series on Colossians. Today we're going to be talking about Colossians chapter 3. We've done Colossians chapters 1 and 2. So if you haven't heard those, I would encourage you to go back and listen to them, although you can do that after you listen to this one too. But chapter 1, we talked about the creation story and how Paul's really playing out a couple of creation stories. And in the Greek mind, they would hear those as creation myths. And we talked about what that meant. But that's an image that really dominates chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we talked about this one verse that talks about the shadow versus reality and how the Greek mind would have heard that. Of course, it would take them to Plato and his allegory of the cave. And once you see that, there's a lot of other things that I think jump out at you in Colossians chapter 2. So that brings us to Colossians chapter 3. But actually, Jared, at dinner last night, I knew you had said that you had taught the book of Colossians in your church one time.
Yeah.
And I was interested in whether this approach that I've really gotten a lot out of, whether this approach, not is it better or worse, but like how is it changed the way that you read Colossians?
It is, we talked about this because, when you teach through a book of the Bible, I tend to go verse by verse. And so what that means is, I've only got 45 minutes or an hour per lesson. And so you kind of got to zip through some of the stuff. And again, you kind of look at it like, well, this is a typical introduction that Paul would give in his letters. So you might read it, but you're going to gloss past it. And I never think about it in terms of the Greek listener that's steeped in mythology, that's steeped in the teachings of Socrates and Plato and things like that. And you do kind of tend to miss a lot of subtleties. I mean, I think we pick up the main points. There's obviously problems in Colossae that he's addressing, and he directly addresses them. So we pick up the main themes. But I think when we look at it the way we're looking at it on these episodes, is it gives you a chance to have I think a little bit more of a complete picture. And what I ended up doing for these episodes that I didn't have a chance to do when I taught through Colossians is I'm able to see particular words pop out at me, particular ideas that I tended to just say, well, he's just saying that Jesus was there with God in the beginning and he's the creator of all things and things like that. And that's simple theology for the modern Christian, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think about it in terms of what the original Greeks were hearing and the way they were processing what Paul was saying. And you miss kind of the brilliance of what Paul is saying and the way he's crafting it. When you think about it that way, you can go back and say, man, he really is tailoring this message to the audience. He's not just spitting off a bunch of flowery words. He's being very carefully crafting his message to be heard by the audience in Colossae. And so when you really understand that, you realize it's not just a bunch of flowery language, poetic language. He's actually using that to serve a purpose. And when you understand that purpose, it kind of opens up the whole book and a new way of looking at the book.
Yeah. So I think that's been interesting, and I've even learned so much just in our conversations as we kind of flesh that out. But that's kind of our approach to this series. This is not a verse by verse study, and I think that one of the things you and I are both learning is that when you go verse by verse, sometimes you miss the larger threads that's being woven. And once you get a picture of the image that Paul is painting for each chapter, Then you go back and look at each verse, and we would encourage you.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, encouraged. Go back and read the chapter after the podcast because it really does.
And see if you read it.
Things.
Yeah, see if you read it differently. So that's kind of the hope, because we've even seen that just as we've been talking, as once you see the bigger theme, then you go back and you start to pick out individual verses and go, yeah, well, that makes sense now.
Yeah,
that fits right into what the picture that Paul's trying to paint.
Sure, yeah.
So we're going to continue that today in Colossians chapter 3, and actually we're going to start out with the first 3 verses, because the first 3 verses, again, I think set the image, and we'll talk about the image for the rest of the chapter, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Colossians 3, verse 1 says, "Since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on the things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God."
Yeah, it's another case where it's easy to read these verses. We go right to the theological, the spiritual idea behind it, but I think we first have to ask the question, what's the picture that Paul is painting, and how would his first century audience have heard this?
Yeah, because I hear this and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, this all makes sense. We've died to ourselves. We've been raised with Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it kind of has that nice flowery language that Paul likes to use. What else is there to see here?
Yeah. Well, and so it's a picture of baptism, and that shouldn't be like big startling news, but that's really what Paul's painting a picture of. Is that's what happens in baptism. So you died with Christ, and then you're raised with Christ. And that's a picture, literally, what happens in the sacrament of baptism.
Sure.
So keep in mind that the Colossian Christians have already been baptized. Paul is writing to a group of Colossians where he makes it clear in chapter 1 that he said, look, when Epaphras told you the message, when he gave you the gospel, you guys accepted it, right? And that almost certainly back in that day would have included baptism. So I think we can safely assume that they've already been baptized.
Yeah,
so,
this isn't a new concept to them.
Yeah, this isn't a new concept. It's not something that Paul's explaining to them. But I think as we go through this chapter and start to really unpack it, what Paul's doing is Paul's saying, you need to be reminded of what your baptism meant.
Okay.
So we'll see that in the coming verses here. You'll see a couple of words every couple of verses that in the Greek would jump out at you more than they do in the English. Sometimes we lose some obviousness of the meaning in our English translation, even though it's easier for us to understand. So I think what Paul is actually doing is, in chapter 3, he's actually going to symbolically walk them through their baptism again. Okay? So let's skip down to verse 5. Verse 5 says, put to death, okay? So we already said, Paul said, you've died and your life is now in Christ, right? So Paul again says, okay, so here's what we're going to do then. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. And he lists things: immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, things like that. So that's the first word we need to pay attention to, is put to death.
Right.
Okay? The second word is in verse 8, where he says, now you must also rid yourself of things. Now that word rid yourself also has the meaning of to lay aside, or to kind of, it's like if you have a garment and it says, no, put that coat down, put it over there. You don't need that anymore, right?
Shed that part of you.
Shed that part of you, yeah.
Right.
So now he says, rid yourselves, and he kind of talks about some more, what we'd say vices or bad habits: anger, rage, malice, slander, all these things. Don't lie to each other, since you've taken your old self off. And verse 9 is actually another word where it says to take off. More precisely, he says in verse 9, since you have taken off your old self and its practices.
Right.
So that's the third word there, of take off. And that literally is a reference to clothing. You would take off what you're wearing right now.
Right.
And essentially Paul's saying, because you don't need that.
Right.
That's not your uniform for the task you've been given.
Yeah. And if you take something off, then you have to replace it with something.
And you have to replace it with something. Yeah.
That's right.
So then we skip down to, or we go just to the very next verse, and he said, and you've put on the new self, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is being renewed in the knowledge and the image of its creator. And that creator, again, refers back to that creation story in chapter 1, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So there again, you start to see these themes woven throughout the letter.
Yeah.
That Paul continually keeps before them. But that last word then is you have put on. And like you said, if you take something off, you have to put something on. And again, that word put on very specifically refers to, it would be the way they'd say, here, put this piece of clothing on.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? So when we take those 4 words, and again, those 4 words are a little more obvious in the original text because of the way they're written. So we have these 4 words, put to death, lay aside, take off, and then put on.
Yeah, and when I read this, and because you asked me when I taught through Colossians, my tendency was to focus on the actual words that he says to take off. You know what I mean? So back again in verse 5, put to death what belongs to your worldly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desire, greed, which is all idolatry. And so me or you probably your local pastor, he's going to focus on those words that follow. And that's why it's kind of harder to see this pattern a little bit. But once you kind of take out the things that he's telling you to put off and put on, you do see that pattern a little bit more clearly. It's just spread over several verses.
Yeah,
with lots of things to put. Look, sexual immorality.
Lots of ideas around them, and
right. And our tendency, I think, a modern reader would look at that and focus on what he's telling us to put off. Remember, go back to the rules. Here's the rules: take off no sexual matter, no impurity, no lust. But what he's trying to lay out is, no, I'm laying out a pattern of shedding the old self, putting on Christ, and becoming something new. And I don't know if they would have heard that more clearly or if it's just the way I read it again, But you can see the pattern clearly now that you point that out.
Yeah, I think that's right. We would focus on all the individual vices, you might say.
Sure, the components
what does anger mean? What does lust mean? What is, all this and all that? Where I think the emphasis for Paul is, no, it's actually the process. It's the pattern that he's building.
Right. And he gives examples.
Yeah.
For the readers.
For example,
that's
put
right.
to death this, for example.
Yeah, we all know that.
Lay aside
They know
this.
These things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think you're right. So this pattern starts to emerge. And so what it's a pattern of is actually, again, we go back to baptism, right? It's a pattern of putting to death your old self.
Right.
You would be immersed in water or sprinkled, depending on your tradition. And when you emerged, most people would teach the baptism ceremony that, something new has emerged, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And depending on your tradition, I don't know if you remember yours, but, depending on your tradition, I remember that, I wanted to be baptized, and I remember changing into this robe, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and then like the pastor said some nice, he went over the thing and said,
buried in his
you got
death.
it. We heard that.
Buried in his death.
See if we can remember it actually. Raised in the image of his likeness to walk in newness of life. I think that's it.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So again, he said those words and he dunked you, and then like you would go up the other side, and of course people would say, "Yay,"
Mm-hmm.
and you'd take, and you were wet, and someone had a towel, and so you'd towel off, and then you go change back into your old clothes, right?
Yeah, that's right. Back in your street clothes.
Yeah, which again, in this context, is kind of symbolically not the thing to do. Is go back and put the old clothes on that you came in with,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
We kind of got that back.
But for the service, you just continue wearing the wearing the robe for the rest of your life.
But the point is, and again, in depending on your tradition, if you got sprinkled, it might be different, or however you did it. But the baptism ritual symbolizes the very thing that Paul is outlining here, which is, and again, if you were immersed, it's kind of the more close to what
obviously
Paul's
a burial. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're taking off what you wore, right?
Yep.
And you're putting on some kind of robe. You're being immersed in the water, which is a symbol of burial, right? And that at that point, it symbolizes, okay, you have died, right? And that's something, I don't know, we can talk about this, but I don't know if a lot of Christians make that strong a connection to say, when I'm getting baptized, regardless how you do it, like, this is me voluntarily dying.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, because in America, we're so individualistic. The idea of dying to self, well, that's almost anti-American, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so, we embrace the words, so we'll use that word, die to self, especially in the church. but I don't think we fully understand it and fully embrace the idea behind it.
Yeah.
That we're literally dying. Our old self is dying. It's passed away, and we're putting on something new.
Yeah.
And again, it's easier said than done, and maybe that's why we go through the ritual to kind of reinforce that idea. But to go back to point in verse 9, I thought this was interesting. He says, "Don't lie to one another, since you've put off the old self." And I read that, and I'm thinking, well, no, there's lots of reasons not to lie to each other. Nobody's going to trust you.
Yeah.
You're not going to be a trustworthy person. And that kind of goes back to the idea of the pattern is what's important in these verses, not the individual things like lying and slander and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Because he's using those as examples, that's fine. But he's not saying don't lie. He's not trying to make an argument of why we shouldn't lie or why we shouldn't slander each other.
Yeah.
He's just saying none of that. I'm not trying to convince you not to lie. I'm saying that's all part of the old self, and that dies, and that's gone.
Yeah.
So when you lie, you're actually a dog going back to his vomit. You're going back to the old self when you've been created in something new. And understand that is, well, to go back to the last episode, that's the shadow. That's not the reality. Quit going back to that.
Right.
You're something different now. That's what he's saying. And again, he's not trying to tell you why you shouldn't do all these that list of things.
Yeah, yeah.
He's saying you're something different now. That's no longer part of you.
Yeah, I think that's right. He could have listed any number of things.
Right.
But I think he's trying to establish a pattern of, no, these things were part of your old self, and remember, that old self is dead.
Yeah, that's right.
And so why the heck would you want to drudge it up and put it on?
Yeah, that's right.
It's almost like a buried T-shirt. It's like, why do you want to dig that up out of the ground and put it on?
Yeah, that's right.
It's something like that. So
yeah.
And it could have been I like what you just said, because it says don't lie to each other, but he could have gone on and on.
Sure,
verse after verse after verse.
Why not?
Quit
why
doing this.
Lie, yeah.
Like
creates distrust. It creates all but he doesn't go down that road because the pattern's what's important.
Yeah, the pattern's
and
what's
not
important.
the specifics, and that's what we tend to focus in on.
Yeah. So to complete the image, then you are raised out of the water, and of course that's resurrection. We are resurrected with Christ.
Right.
But what is resurrected is a new life. It's a new creation. There again, ties back to chapter 1.
Yeah, that's right.
We're part of new creation now. We are not part of old. And so what has emerged is a new person.
Right.
And that's why the last it's funny now that we talk about it, because that's why then the last thing you should do is put on your old clothes,
Right.
But we know that's just, that's the
again, that's the symbology of the service.
Yeah.
To reinforce the idea. But yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. I can see the pattern that's laid out there. One thing I was going to ask you is in verse 3, you can kind of gloss over it if you're not paying attention. But he says in verse 3, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with the Messiah in God." Like, why is it hidden? I didn't quite understand that. When you focus in on it, it's like, well, I thought we were supposed to let our light shine, right? Don't hide our lives under a bushel. We're supposed to put ourselves out there. Why would he use those words that your life is hidden with the Messiah and God? Yeah,
that's an interesting phrase. And I think in one sense I could see Paul saying, while you are, you are a new creation, and what should come through is Christ.
Right.
And not you. But at the same time, you are this new creation, then you are to embody Christ, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So maybe it's more along the lines of what people should see is an embodiment of Christ and not the old you.
Yeah.
But then it's interesting.
You're buried in Christ somehow.
Yeah. You've been buried.
Right.
So what people should see is Christ.
Right.
And maybe he's getting to that, because in verse 4, then it says, actually, when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. And that's kind of interesting, too, because it's like, well, we'll be resurrected, but it's actually
it's like more than that.
That's when the true you, who God created you to be, will fully emerge.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's actually what it's getting at.
Yeah, well, that's a cool idea, that until the return, then my life is merely hidden in the Messiah.
Yeah.
Right? And then when he returns, I'll be truly transformed.
Yeah.
Okay.
But this idea of being hidden is also interesting, because it's one of those words that a first century Greco-Roman would have heard differently than we hear it. And you see this more in a book like Ephesians, where Paul uses all kinds of words like secret knowledge, hidden knowledge, things will be revealed, insights.
Yeah.
And all this is language of a mystery religion. And mystery religions were very common back in Paul's day, and we can talk about a couple of examples of that. But I actually think that starts to steer this image of baptism then to ask, okay, how would someone coming out of a pagan culture have heard baptism? And the answer is they would have heard all of this as an initiation rite into a mystery religion.
Okay, when you say mystery religion, that sounds like a cult.
That's spooky, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there were a lot of examples of mystery religions back in Paul's day. And these were kind of, beyond just kind of the standard, we go to the temple of Apollo and we do this and we worship Zeus and, we go through the rituals, which is all very different from our idea of religion, but that's what they did.
Right.
That you also had mystery religions. You also had kind of fringe groups that would offer secret insights into the world.
Okay.
They would offer you glimpses into what we would say like the heavenly realm, the spiritual realm.
Okay.
Where you could really kind of have this, otherworldly experience and then come back changed.
Yeah.
Probably
the Masons. The Masons are Scientologists. See, that's what keeps the whole mystery religion.
Modern
That
day,
keeps dragging me the Scientology or something like that.
So we have a couple of examples of this. First, we know the cult of Isis was pretty popular, and of course you go, well, ISIS, isn't that Egyptian? But it's interesting because what happened is the Roman soldiers who were stationed in Egypt brought home to them this cult of Isis.
Huh.
And, so it wasn't kind of on the official list, but then you go around these towns and you can see that they had in their archaeological remains, they found like temples to Isis, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we see in the cult of Isis is we actually see, and there's an account of it that has been preserved, is that they actually go through this process. So initiates actually go through this process of, and the account that we have still took place by the ocean, and the initiates literally just took their clothes off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they went and they bathed in the ocean. And then they came out, and it was symbolic of what is coming out is a new person, right? What is emerging is a new person.
Sure, that sounds familiar.
Yep, the old one died in the ocean, drowned in the ocean, and now what's emerging is new. Yeah, it sounds familiar, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so we know that that's what the cult of Isis, we know that initiating into the cult of Isis actually included something very similar to what Christians would call the baptismal ritual. We also, probably the best example of a mystery religion is the Eleusinian mysteries. And we have, I sometimes say it's kind of like Fight Club, right? What's the first rule of Fight Club?
Yeah, nobody talks about
Nobody
Fight
fights.
Club, that's right.
Well, that's the same thing. We have all these references to the Eleusinian mysteries, but no one really talks about it. No one really says, here's what went down.
Right.
Because the first rule of the mysteries is, hey, it's secret.
Yeah, keep hush-hush.
Yeah.
I can tell
Don't
you,
write stuff down.
Right.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
So it's very much like that. But the Eleusinian mysteries were the dominant mystery religion of the day. And a lot of famous people from that time actually kind of said, hey, I've got my membership card in the Eleusinian mysteries, even though no one really talked about it.
Right. Right.
But we do know a little bit about what they did, and we know they had something very similar, initiation rite, where they would take their clothes off, they would immerse themselves, and then in some instances they would actually be given a robe to put on. And it was the same thing. It was like your old self died, now you're part of this mystery cult, right? And now you are a new person.
Yeah, and you put on something new.
Yeah. So actually, the Eleusinian mysteries, I don't know if you remember when we were in Athens.
Sure.
We went outside
the road. It was
that archaeological site that was kind of the road out.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And went to Plato's University. Was that?
Yeah, it kind of went by that, but
right,
it was one of the original gates of Athens.
Right.
And it went through a cemetery, right? All that.
Yeah, I remember all that. Sure.
So if you remember, the road was actually part of the Eleusinian Way.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember that part.
Yeah, I remember you pointing that out.
Yeah. So that road was actually part of the Eleusinian Way, because what it did was it connected a temple in the agora where we were at
Right.
to a city or a town called Eleusis outside of Athens.
Okay.
And so they would do a whole procession right outside of that gate that we were at.
Yeah.
That's why it was called the Eleusinian Way. So that's part of the Eleusinian mysteries.
Okay. Yeah, and it was pretty confusing, well, because the city is all built up now, modern city.
Yeah.
But we were leaving the old city walls, and yeah, you kind of pictured obviously no buildings and things like that, and the path going, it was about a mile or so that we walked out.
Yeah, nowadays it's hard to picture, but when you walked out of that gate,
Right.
in that day, it just would have been like open fields and trees. And
Yeah. Well, I've heard the term Eleusinian Way before.
yeah.
And well, I've heard mysteries also too, but it's a mystery. It's always been kind of one of those things like, yeah, what's that all about? What's the mystery? Surely we know it now, right?
Yeah.
But I guess not.
No.
Okay, so that brings up a question then. Why did Paul feel the need to borrow these ideas from, I mean, you call it the cult of Isis or
Yeah.
the Eleusinian mysteries? Why did Paul feel the need to pull these things in, especially after chapter 2 we were just talking about? Don't worry about the
New Moon Festival, that list,
yeah,
right?
and the Sabbath
day.
things like that. It's like, don't judge each other on those things. So, because those are just shadows of the real thing.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 3, he brings in these kind of mysteries. Why do you think that is? What's the significance there?
Well, so on the surface, I think one way to read this is, oh, wow, Paul's borrowing these things. That seems like an odd thing to do.
Completely ripping them off.
Yeah, but actually, I think we see it as a larger archetype that everyone had, right? So we even see this in the Old Testament with the whole idea of washing in a ceremonial pool, right?
Sure.
Before you go into the temple.
Yeah, the idea of death and rebirth is nothing novel in this time, right?
Right.
It happened over and over. Sure.
I think that's the better way to see it is, the whole idea of death and rebirth before you enter into someplace sacred. It was not novel to the Greeks. It was not novel even to Christianity. It's just, you could almost say it's one of those patterns that's been embedded in any kind of religion.
Right.
Period, right?
Okay, sure.
And we saw this even at Delphi, right? You bathed in the spring before you went up the sacred way.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was kind of the same idea. It's kind of like this baptism, right? It's
symbolic cleansing that is symbolic of cleaning out your mind, cleaning out your... Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't know that Paul's so much borrowing from the cult of Isis. I don't think Paul probably would do that.
Right.
You could also argue that he's borrowing from the Old Testament imagery of, washing, or maybe even the Jewish practice at the time of going into a mikveh and cleansing yourself and drying off before now you're pure and now you can go into the temple.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Okay.
So it was more just it was so well known, it was such a larger pattern that Paul's not really, he doesn't even have to borrow from these things. It's just known to them.
Right.
But from, I think, the Greek perspective, if you're sitting in Colossae, like, you would absolutely recognize the
these
pattern.
things are familiar.
On the flip side, Paul didn't have to explain the Jewish practice of bathing in a mikveh, right?
Yeah, okay. That makes
because
sense.
they were already familiar with this idea.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's what my buddy did when he joined the Eleusinian mysteries, right?
Yeah, that's right. So he took the archetype that was known by the Greeks and used that language so that they would be familiar with it, as opposed to re-educating them on the Hebrew traditions.
Yeah, it was just such common language.
Right. Okay.
That he didn't have to draw from Isis or Eleusinian or anything like that. It was just, the pattern was there, and everyone would have recognized it. I think it's us who don't recognize it today. Right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, we see this larger pattern, and remember, Paul is reminding them of what they've already done, right?
Right.
They've been baptized. I think that's a fair assumption.
Right.
So Paul is actually reminding them of the ceremony that they already went through. So Paul is, again, he's reinfusing it with meaning in language that they already, in a practice they already did, but language that they already fully understood. So
right, calling them back to what they've already done.
Yeah.
Because they've gotten away from that ideal. Okay.
Right. So that's what Paul's doing here. He's going through the pattern again. Remember, you died, you laid aside, you took your clothes off, right?
Right.
You immersed yourself, and now you have risen with Christ, and now you're going to put on a new thing.
Right.
That's the pattern.
Okay.
So I think it raises another question then. with this idea of, could you then call Christianity a type of mystery religion?
Well, yeah, that was where I was going earlier. That's right. It seems a little strange, right?
Right, and it starts to go, look, this isn't just another mystery religion.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would say Paul wasn't actually afraid to use the language of that. And you see, again, I think you see this more in the book of Ephesians, where he's not afraid to kind of put all these terms. Look, this was hidden, and now I'm revealing it to you.
Right.
It's going to give you secret insights.
Yeah.
You're going to have knowledge of what's actually happening in the spiritual world.
Right.
Like, he actually very much puts that out there in the book of Ephesians.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think you can safely say that Paul wasn't afraid to frame Christianity in terms of, this is the true thing you are seeking, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And they were all familiar with these other mystery religions.
Yeah.
And they're all trying to kind of run these other directions and probably borrowing from some of those other religions and possibly cults and things like that. So Paul is okay with using some of that language and imagery, but he's pointing out and saying, yeah, stop going there, because here's the truth. Here's the reality.
Yeah.
Right. Go back to your original baptism, your original death and rebirth.
Yeah.
Right. And stop running after these other things. Okay.
Now,
and in fact, he mentions those things.
Yeah, he mentions those things.
Right.
But one thing you just mentioned that I think I've been trying to process through, because it's one of those things that we hear and we think we know what Paul's saying. But when Paul, because several places Paul says, I'm telling you to, have faith in Christ because it's true.
Right.
And it's another, maybe a rabbit trail on this, but it's this other idea of what did Paul mean that he says it's true? Because that would be Paul's big assertion here. He's like, look, there's these other cults out there and all this, but I'm telling you Christianity's true. I think we hear that and we go, or maybe we have a tendency to go, Paul's trying to assert maybe the factfulness of the life of Jesus and that he rose again, and certainly I'm not arguing against that.
Right. The Western, our mind goes, if something's true, it means it's scientifically provable type thing, accurate, whatever, in the material world.
Right.
But you're saying he means something different.
Well, I'm saying I think he might mean at times something larger, which is, if you think of this idea of truth is what corresponds closest to reality, right?
Yes.
And
yes,
so
that's right.
I think in some sense you could say Paul is saying this is true because it will get you closer to the reality of Christ, the reality of all these things that you're seeking, than these other things will.
Yeah, and those other things can be a reflection of it or something like that, but they're not the real deal. They're not the truth. They don't correspond accurately, completely with reality.
And that takes us back then. Again, I love all these threads that you start, because that goes back to the shadow versus
shadows
reality.
And the reality. Yeah, that's right.
What's true?
Right. Yeah, that's
The
right.
reality is true.
Right. That's
not
right.
the shadow.
Right.
Right. So I'm not discounting Paul. Certainly, Paul says, look, Jesus was a person who lived, 30, 40, 50 years ago. They crucified him and he rose from the grave. That's part of it.
Right.
But I wonder sometimes when Paul says this is true, especially against this backdrop, he's saying, look, this corresponds to the reality you're looking for.
Yes, that's
not
right.
the shadows you're dabbling in.
Well, and I think that's why he started out. He didn't start out with a historical birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He started out with Christ being before all time and space and being with God.
Well, yeah, that's right.
Right,
Yep.
and that's why John, that's the difference between the Gospel of John and the other Gospels. The other Gospels start at Jesus' birth, is a historical representation. Here's what I saw, and here's what Jesus did, and here's his ministry. John starts something and does something a little bit different. He goes all the way back to the beginning of all time, and that's what Paul's doing. And when Paul does that, it's almost like he's saying, yes, I know that you know about Christ, the literal person that walked around with your grandfathers.
And they accepted that, right?
Right, that's right.
Because he says that in chapter 1.
Yes, I'm talking about the Christ that was before all time.
Yeah.
The deeper meaning there. And that's the ideal that he's
Yeah.
pointing to. And so you're right, that when if you go back to chapter 2, you can see that he's saying, he don't want to confuse them. That's why he's not talking about truth, meaning that Jesus died and rose again. Of course he believes that.
Yeah.
He's talking about truth of Christ, the one that before time, before all existence. And that's the ideal, and that's what we've put on.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Which is interesting because, we run around with the bracelets. What would Jesus do, right?
Yeah.
And we've seen that. And it's funny because
Did you run around with those?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Actually, I'm sure I had one. I'm sure I was given one, It's kind of a cool little thing to point out, at least at some time, right? Back in the day.
All right. So I have to jump in here and say, because I had just read this morning on a good source of news, which is the Babylon Bee.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
So what you just said reminded me.
This is a rabbit trail here.
Yeah.
Because we're going to start having Babylon Bee stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
2 hours later, we'll be swapping
right.
bee headlines. But anyway, like you just said, what would Jesus do? But I just saw this headline this morning that said something to the effect of Jesus' brothers and sisters irritated because Mary gives them WWJD bracelets, and I could see that didn't go over well. But
I love that. I absolutely love the bee.
So I had to throw that in there as we were talking about it. So,
but it's a funny saying, because what would Jesus do? And it's like, well, I don't really picture Jesus playing football. I don't picture him rooting at a basketball game or some stuff that I think is completely fine. It's like I don't really picture Jesus doing that either. But that's the historical man Jesus, right?
Right.
But if you go back to the before all time, the ideal, the one that was with God before the world was created, that, what would that Jesus do? And that kind of gives you a different frame of reference rather than, hey, what would the historical Jesus in the robe and sandals and long hair, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? What would he do in this instance? Like, well, you can obviously use that too, but that only goes so far. Let's go back to all of creation. What does the ideal embodiment of God do?
Yeah.
And that has a little bit different feel to it.
Yeah, I think that's a much larger picture that we sometimes lose sight of, that he's calling them to. Like,
right.
No. Yeah, okay, the Son of God walked the earth, and was crucified a while ago, and I can attest that all that's true, but beyond that, I'm talking about the creator of the world.
Yeah, I'm going back a lot further than that.
And if you really want to delve the mysteries of the world, I'm telling you to keep following this Jesus person.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, you want a mystery, you want an adventure. That's it.
Yeah.
And you guys are looking for your mysteries in your cult of Isis or whatever other things they're borrowing from. He's like, man, I've got a real adventure. I've got a real mystery for you.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of the Jesus that your grandparents knew being there at the beginning of the world. And that would blow their mind, sure.
Yeah, and I think it's such a cool message, actually, when you see that emerge out of the book of Colossians, because that's really what he's doing. He's talking to people who accepted Christ and they've lost a little bit of steam in their faith, right?
Right.
The initial high is worn off. And I think that's something that most people can relate to.
Oh,
right?
yeah. But you talk about something, a practical application to it that
we've
all kind of gone through.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And
what
so
do you do once the excitement's gone?
Yeah.
In those the dry times, the wilderness, right?
Yeah.
How do you handle it? Do you run to other things?
Do you run to
go back to Christ?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
And part of I think to bring this full circle, then part of the answer that Paul is saying, so how do you bring this back, And what he's doing, Paul's method is, let's talk about how you got initiated into this in the beginning. And, so again, I think those are actually great questions. Like, so let's go through the steps again, So the step one is put to death, right?
Right.
So what is this idea? I think we can continually ask ourselves, what do I need to put to death?
Right. And you don't have to think long to come up with something.
Right, if you're honest with yourself.
Yeah, like in one sense, man, I'm a good guy. I'm a family man. I've got a job. People would say, hey, yeah, JR is a nice guy. But, yeah, if I dig a little bit myself and look in the mirror, it doesn't take long to come up with things. Yeah, that needs to die, man. That needs to be gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to kind of constantly revisit that as opposed to rest on the fact that, yeah, I'm a nice guy. Nobody would think I'm robbing a bank or anything like that, right? I'm a decent dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to go back and really look deep into yourself.
Well, and to connect it back to what you had said earlier, which is, I think there is something with those things that he listed, which is, these need to be put to death because they are absolutely incompatible with the new person you have become.
Right.
They're not just bad habits. It's not like, well, I like to sleep in on Saturdays or something.
Yeah,
No, these are incompatible with your new life.
Right.
And so I think that's a good thing to say, okay, what do I need to put to death? Well, is there anything that I'm carrying around with me that if I am honest, this is just incompatible
Right. Yeah.
with what I'm called to?
Yeah. Anger, selfishness, all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the lay aside, okay?
Right.
So your diet, but then you're like, shed the clothes, you're going to lay them aside. And I think that's, maybe you could see that as a bit of a different category. And this might fall into what are the things that I know are kind of dragging me down,
Yeah.
You wouldn't necessarily put them in the category of they need to die, this is incompatible. But if I'm honest with myself, I should knock this off. Or
Yeah, we've talked about this before. It's like, how much time do I spend on my phone just doing pointless, stupid things? How much time do I waste time? And there's just so many, because of technology, there's just so many ways to waste time. You can't even go to the bathroom in silence. You got to take some kind of electronic equipment in there to,
Right.
spend, you know what I mean? And it's just, so yeah, kind of looking at these are not things that are necessarily, that they have to put to death, but they are things that have to be laid aside and tempered and regulated in how much I go to those things. Because before long, you can find out, man, how many times have you been on your phone and thought, man, an hour went by and I was watching 8-second videos,
Yeah.
and you can go down the rabbit hole really quick on that. So yeah, it's just something. How do I control those things in my life? How can I lay that aside?
Yeah.
And have a little bit more control of my time.
Yeah, and then the next one is put on. And again, he says, you do that, you put this to death, you lay this aside, but then the picture is you're a resurrection with Christ, but then you put something on, you put on a new nature.
Right.
And I think that's a great question too, because Paul's saying actively, what do you need to now include?
Right.
Right? Which is different from just saying, oh, look, I'm a new person.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, and so I think that's a great question too, is like, what do I need to start including, to start doing?
Yeah. And how can I make my life meaningful? Because when you're doing something meaningful, you'll find that you don't do the stupid time-wasting things, right?
Yeah. We talked about that, and that's one thing I think I brought back from our trip from Greece is quit wasting time doing this and pour yourself into what you're passionate about.
Right. And it's when you do that, and I don't want to sound like kind of just surface stuff, but when you do pour yourself into something meaningful, you'll find that you lose track of time doing that. You lose yourself in whatever, whether it's playing an instrument or whether it's writing or whether it's reading or something like that. When you're doing something truly meaningful, all those other little time wasters things, you almost don't even have to lay those aside. Those are going to lay themselves aside because you're not interested in them anyway.
Right.
You're engaged in something meaningful. So yeah, how do we put that on, and what does that mean?
Yeah, that's actually a good way to think about it, is not so much what do I need to lay aside, but if I fully poured myself into the things that God had called me to, these things would naturally just be pushed aside anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, and that's where we have to keep our eyes, I think, on, the ideal. Because you could say, well, I think I'm doing pretty well right now. I'm pretty busy. Maybe I don't need to add on anything.
Right.
But if I compare myself with the ideal of Christ, okay,
now it's obvious.
But
what we do is we compare ourselves to other people.
Yeah.
Like, man, there's a whole lot of more screwed up people than me,
Yeah.
I'm not doing drugs in the alley, right? So I'm doing pretty good, But yeah, when you have the ideal, then you have a direction and something to aim for, and you find out how far you fall short of that.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to start saying this over and over because I actually see the pattern, but like that goes back to chapter 2 then, right? Paul says, quit comparing yourself to what other people are doing.
Yeah, sure.
Quit judging yourself by, who showed up to this event and who went to that event. And,
yeah. And start comparing yourself to the ideal.
Yeah.
And then you get a clear picture of what you really need to lay aside, because that becomes painfully obvious.
And maybe that goes back to, what was it, verse 3 or 4? Yeah. Your life is now hidden in Christ, and then when Christ who appears is your life, then you also will appear. Maybe that's maybe that sheds light on that verse.
Yeah, the hidden part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I do. I like so you're right. You have this pattern, and when you see it, you kind of gloss over the specific things that he's telling us to put off, not because it doesn't matter, because the pattern is more important. And yeah, you try to go back to that in your own life. And we talk about that. Go back to your salvation experience. Go back to your baptism. Whatever is important and significant to you, go back to that moment and try to recall that ascent, descent, right? What can I take away from that ascent and that spiritual moment? And how can I revisit that idea and recalibrate my life to that ideal instead of this distracted person that I've become that's gotten off the path?
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, so actually, the more you unpack this, the big ideas, I really do think you can almost see the I don't know what you'd say, the pastoral direction that Paul's trying to push them in.
Right, yeah, that's right.
Knock all this stuff out. Like, look, let's go back to your baptism. Let's go back to what Epaphras told you in the beginning.
Right.
And what were you doing then that got you so excited?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And then how can you bring that back into your faith? And how can you focus on the ideal and not, what your brother and sister are doing, sitting in church,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And the rest of the chapter, he does get into more specifics of problems that they were engaging in, things that they need to do. But to start it off, he kind of reminds them to go back to the beginning, go back to your commitment. Remember that you've died, remember that you've put on Christ, and that's something different. And then he goes on and addresses it. But you're right. I think it's important that he starts there.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. I love this little book of Colossians.
Yeah, it's great. It's again, man, go back now and read that chapter through this new lens and see if you pick any of this stuff up. I'd love to hear what people thought about it.
Yeah. Go to our website. You can contact us there, or however you're listening to it. If there's an opportunity to connect or subscribe, we'd love to hear from you, because I really do think once you have that pattern in mind, go back and read it and see what emerges.
Yeah, so there you go. We're getting through the book of Colossians. One more chapter to go. We'll tackle that. But yeah, this has been really neat to kind of see the patterns emerge from that, and it does give you a new lens to look through this book.
Yeah.
That's right.
And chapter 4, just a little bit of maybe a little different, because I want to talk a little bit about something that he mentions about the church in Laodicea. And again, talk about mystery. It's a little bit of a mystery, because Paul says, hey, read the letter that I sent to them.
Yeah, that's right.
And we don't have a letter.
So
in the
we'll
Bible
turn to First
called
Laodiceans.
First Laodiceans.
Laodiceans, right?
So we'll tackle that a little bit, because that's kind of an interesting idea too.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Well, if you liked this conversation, a lot more is in a book that I have out called A Journey Through Colossae. That's kind of what we're doing, that, just full disclosure, where I kind of go through a lot more than we've tackled in these podcasts. But that's available. You can see the links in the website, Navigating an Ancient Faith. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right, we'll see you.